Hello.
Yeah, we are
Hello.
here.
Oh, okay.
Give us a minute. Okay. The floor is open. If anybody has any concerns, any ideas, please, you have the floor. Amen. Auntie Ruby, you are welcome.
Thank you, Daddy. Thank you very much. So what we have seen is initially the world was not void like we read. The world was not shapeless. It had shape, we have learned, because of the water. And then it was the light which revealed things in the darkness for us to see. So we are getting somewhere. The Spirit of God moving upon the face of the earth revealed things for us to see, and then we are moving on.
Okay. Anybody else? Dr. Boyce, any ideas, any problems, any?
Oh, I don't have a problem. I'm just reflecting on what we did yesterday concerning the verse 1 when God put the heavens and the earth together, and then 2, he started actually working. So, yeah, my qualm is about the link between 1 and 2, but I think we went over that yesterday. So I'll take it after this.
Okay. Uncle Max, any revelations, any concerns?
Well, picking up on what Dr. Boyson just said, I think the transition between verse 1 and 2 can be problematic. Because if you look at verse 2 on its own, and you look at different versions, different Bible translations, you find that it's not in every version that the word "and" begins the second verse. So the New English translation, for example, says, "Now the earth was without shape and empty." There are other versions. Webster's version, for example, doesn't include "now" or "and." It just says, "The earth was formless and empty." So I think the word "and" in the King James Version suggests a sequentiality which may not actually be there.
That's true. Actually, King James went for continuity of thoughts.
Right. So if we realize that verse 2 doesn't necessarily follow from verse 1, but that it may be just the beginning of the creation process that was captured by verse 1, then I think it dissolves, for me anyway, the in any what's the word? Confusion.
Okay.
Because you recall, I suggested yesterday that the creation process is a three-stage process, where you start with an idea, you start with a thought.
Okay.
And a thought is without form and it is without shape or content. There is a frequency to it, yes. Because a thought can be very specific, it can be very broad. You can't describe it as being a material thing. So it will be without form and therefore void. But it is nonetheless an energy, or a potential, which when articulated through the word, through the creation or the transmutation of energy, when articulated, can then coalesce into a material form or material object. So you've got thought, word, and deed, or thought, word, and appearance, thought, energy, and coalescence or manifestation.
Okay.
Yeah. So as a process, then it removes this dichotomy and confusion, I think, that otherwise arises as to how the earth is starts off without form, and then suddenly somehow the earth acquires a form and so on. Yeah. I think we need to think of it as the mind of God held the idea of the earth and heaven and light and all the rest of it, and then sequentially introduce them from verse 2 onwards.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, at least we are getting to understand the Bible is not just a book you read and go on your merry way, right? You don't go your merry way after reading the Bible shallowly, if I may say that. It's deep, deep. And the more you think about it, the more it actually sucks you into it, right? And it's like it opens you up for more revelations. So thank you, Uncle Max, for that observation. Yes, indeed. Verse 1 and 2, it's like they belong to two different, call it, phases, right? And the question becomes, what do we make of it? How do we proceed? What lessons are there? What secrets are there to be uncovered? And so today, what I want us to do is to look at ways of dealing with tests in order to come up with some hidden ideas that the author may have employed and deployed in his or her writing that could help to really tease out a more advanced, a more fuller meaning than it would appear on a first reading or on a surface reading. You understand that we've discussed it here, that between verse 1 and verse 2, a lot of theologians, Bible scholars, and Christian scientists believe that something may have happened. And in popular literature, they call it the gap theory. And the gap theory posits that God created the earth in the form he wanted it. Then something may have happened to the earth, such that we are given certain descriptions or properties of the earth in verse 2. And those properties make the test a bit more complicated. 1, the earth was without form. 2, the earth was void or empty. 3, darkness covered the face of the deep. And yesterday in our Bible study, and the last week when we had this Bible study, one of the things we contended with is that do we take it that when God created the earth in verse 1, he created it with the features that we see mentioned in verse 2? Or something happened between verse 1 and verse 2, but the Bible decides, or the Bible author, right, either Moses or God, decides that maybe it's none of our business to know what really happened. But then the question is, if you don't want us to know, why do you bother to give us the features? Because the features you give us will force us to ask questions, right? And what I want us to do today is now learn some tricks of reading and then some skills of teasing out certain, especially what we call the actions and then the effects of actions, and then what holds true at a particular point in time. So one of the ways we'll go about today is still on verse 1 to verse 5, right? Can everybody see my screen?
No.
Well, I can see your screen, but it's blank apart from the icons on it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, then let me share. Okay.
Oh,
Can you see it now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What read what is there?
Actions and effects.
Actions and effects. Okay. So I want everybody, if you have your Bible, just open to read and let's begin to tease out certain things, right? Okay. Verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? First question, were they both created at the same time? 2, if that is so, did one act of creation created two things? Or the creation of the earth was different from the creation of the heaven, though the same word create has been used. Amazing, right? Are you getting the?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's something you want to know, right? But again, God decides that He will be silent about that, but just to tell us two different products came into being, whether they came into being at the same time. And God is capable. God is all powerful, all knowing, possesses everything, right? He could do everything just like that. But the fact that we know He could do it doesn't mean we should accept that He did it all at once, right? We want to see how God went about things so we can enrich ourselves, by learning the tricks of God and then being able to act accordingly, right? So 1, in the beginning, which is time, God created the heaven and the earth again. Act of creation, 1, but 2 products. So what I want us to do in verse 1 to 5, Genesis 1 to 5, on the screen, you see all the acts of creation in the actions in verse 1 to 5. See if you agree with me that I've captured all the actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
First, there is a create action, right?
Mm.
Second, there is a move action. God moved
Mm-hmm.
upon the face of the waters. Agreed?
Yes.
Call into being action. God said, let there be light. Right? Do we agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
A divide action. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Mm.
Do we agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then verse 5. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Right? So there was a naming action. Do we agree?
Yeah.
Okay.
We missed one action.
What is it?
The observation action.
And which is, I decided, I decided because it wasn't really an action, right? That really did, but in fact, as we go down, I will explain certain things.
Well,
Because
it involved a judgment, though. He saw the light.
You realize that he
good.
saw that it was good. I left out the judgment. I even left out the seeing, right? Because they didn't bring nothing really concrete into being. I want actions that really did something, right? But I agree, you have a point, right? But when we start looking at actions and their effects, right, we'll be hard-pressed to argue that God seeing something really initiated an effect, right? So that's why I left the seeing and then the judging out, right?
Okay.
I mean, is that a good explanation?
It's a workable one. We can work with it.
Okay. Now, the effects that we see in the text are darkness on surface of earth's deep. True? Verse 2. Right?
Mm.
Do we agree?
Yes.
Another one is no darkness illuminated earth. And I will explain. I could have said illuminated earth with darkness banished. But I felt no darkness illuminated earth, right? Captures more, right? And the simple reason is this. I know, Uncle Mas, I know by now you are brimming with some serious questions, right? But ask your question before I go on. With respect to why I chose no darkness illuminated earth and why I didn't include the earth was void and also the earth was without form. I removed them, or I didn't include them as effects, right? These are the effects, and I'll explain each of them, right?
No, I can understand that. But, you know, one of the questions you asked about verse 1 is whether the heaven came before the earth or vice versa, and so on. If we take verse 1 as a placeholder, yeah, then we can see the answers to those questions further down in the chapter outside of verses 1 to 5. Okay. Because 8 and 10 give us a sequence.
The 8 and 10, let's read from what our Bible says. 8 and 10 says, and God said, let the waters under the heavens, and God called the firmament, or would it be rather from verse 7, right? Or verse 6. And God said, let there be firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters, right? Is
yes.
that?
But
Then,
he actually names it in verse 8, as he
yeah,
named the earth
yeah,
in.
that is true. But again, I think was it last week or not yesterday? We had an interesting take on the naming, right? Because you see capital letters for one, and then small
Yeah.
non-capital letters.
I brought up the point that the naming involves capital letters.
Mm-hmm.
Elsewhere, they use small letters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So,
he has
yeah.
suggested that's the difference.
So, was it just a stylistic something, or it actually forces us to look at either the same thing from multiple angles or two different things, right? Because the firmament, if we look at it, was like a divider, right? A sheet of ice. That's the definition given, right? So how can we say that a sheet of ice actually represents heaven? And down the line, you actually read also the firmament of heaven, because when he was creating light in verse 14. So there are all kinds of things that will need to be addressed, right? And the Bible, as again, this Bible, whoever wrote it was, should I say, well, God, you want us to really think. But it's one of those things. But we'll deal with them as we go on. But Uncle Mars, those are the things. As I said, when it comes to the fluence, I didn't include the earth was void, the earth was formless, right? But I included darkness on the face of the deep, and I will explain why, right? Because of three things that down the line, I'll teach, right? What we call the three types of arguments that we mentioned yesterday: the deductive argument, the abductive argument, and the inductive argument. Deductive argument simply is if you are given the actions and you are also given the effects, what holds true at what time based on the effects and the actions that cause the effects, if you consider them, and that will help you to predict what is about to happen. And then you have the abductive argument, where you are given the effects and then what is true at a particular time, and then you have to come up with the series of actions or events that could have initiated the effects, and therefore the truth of the effect at any particular time, right? So again, in a deductive argument, you are given both the actions, call it the causes, and the effects, and then you have to determine whether what the combination of the cause and the effect, or the actions and the effect, will render a particular observation true or false at any particular point in time. That's deductive argument. Then the abductive argument, on the other hand, is you are given the effects, and then you are given what is true at a particular time, and then you have to infer or come up with what series of actions could have initiated the effects. Is that making sense? And then we have the final one, the inductive argument. Here you are given the causes, and then what is true at any particular point in time, and you have to come up with the effects that the two will produce. So you have the deductive, you have the abductive, and you have the inductive. We'll look at them, and it will help us to really understand this very, very deep, interesting book called the Bible. And it will help us to really develop our minds, not only for the Bible, for all data. And it will help us to see things that we normally will not see. Amen. Okay, so we've seen the actions / causes, and then we've seen the effects in just Genesis 1 to 5. Now, the next thing we are going to do now is to connect each action to the effect or effects it created or initiated. So I'm going to introduce you to some technical language. And the technical language are certain keywords. One of them is initiates, another one is terminates, and then a third one is holds at, right? The simple explanation is the initiates technical word helps you to identify the cause and the effect it produced at what time, right? I said the initiates keyword helps you to identify the cause and the effect at what time. Mind you, one cause or one action could initiate multiple actions and multiple effects, right? And multiple actions could actually also initiate just one effect. So the cause and the effect, the actions and the effect equation could be many to many. Is that making sense? Hello? Hello? Yep. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now, let's look at the screen again. So we have actions that initiated effects, right? So the first one is the action called created, right? You see that I have the word initiate, the key word here, right? Because it is just to guide me. But the word that denotes action in the text is created, right? In Genesis 1:1. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Right? Now, God created the heavens. So we identify the agent and what the agent does. So in terms of the created, in logic, we call this first order calculus, right? Now, God created the heaven, right? That is one act, because we are dealing with the creating aspect, the action. Then the second part of that equation has to do with the effect of the first part, the one to the left, right? So don't forget the created here, right, has to do with God and the product, heaven and earth. But what will be the effect of the creation of the heaven and the creation of the earth? We are not told, but the thing we know that another down the line will introduce you what we call the common law of inertia. When something is brought into being or something is unleashed or whatever, the common sense of inertia says it will remain as it is unless another action causes something to happen to it. let me give you an example. If I put a book on my table or my desk, right? The common law of inertia says the book will remain there unless somebody takes it away or some event happens to knock it from where I placed it. Is that making sense?
You have become a physicist, Pastor Akro. That is awesome.
Right? Yeah. But you are looking at this awesome Bible and the things it can force us to understand. Right? So, if God created the heaven and the earth, the common law, common sense law of inertia says the heaven and the earth will be there, period, in the form and the state God created it or created them. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
But I also want you to look at the third thing there. There is a T, that's the time, right? We call it time one. One of the key things you learn from this point on is to be able to identify time elements in texts, because it will help you to understand how things in literature we say that an author can adopt a pattern of exposition, right? One of them is chronology, where one thing happens after the other, right? In logic also, especially with artificial intelligence logic, we have time. We say time is linear. That means it moves forward. But we also have time that is branching. That means if, let's say, I go to bed, the next thing, according to the linear movement of time, is that I fall asleep, right? But the branching aspect of time also could say, I could have multiple things that I could do after going to bed. One of them could be I could talk to my wife. Another is I may read. Another is I may do all kinds of things, right? But if we are to follow the sequence, if I go to bed, the next thing is fall asleep. And that is the linear, right, aspect of time. And then the branching is where I have multiple options. Is that making sense? So yes. We would argue here that when God created the heaven and the earth, he created them in the form God wanted. And so the heaven and the earth at least existed in the form or state God created them at time T1. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, you realize that number 2 also actually has time T1 because God created the heaven. And so the heaven existed at time T1. Again, God created the earth. So the earth again existed at time T1. But back to the original question I asked, did one act of creation initiate 2 different products or 2 different effects? That we don't know. We don't know. Though God is capable of anything, at least we don't know, especially the magnitude of the objects that were created. You and I cannot create the heaven in one day, right? Or if we can create the heaven in one day, we cannot create the earth also at the same time. So we'll do one after the other. But here we are not told, but what can we say about that? Though the text is silent, right? But what we are building in ourselves is the ability to look at things and not take things for granted. Even if the text seems to be silent on it, we must recognize that there is something in there that possibly we could probe further, right? Because again, one act of creation, but two different products, right? And it will seem as if they were created at the same time. We don't know about that, but you need to take cognizance of that fact. Is that making sense? Hello?
Hello.
Are we appreciating that fact? That
Yes.
Okay. Now, the very difficult point in verse 2. In verse 2, we are introduced to one thing. You realize that I've used XXX and then question mark, question mark, question mark, right? And then the second thing is the earth. Question is, what happened to the earth? The reason being that we are introduced to a condition, not an act of creation. Right? Are you getting the picture clear? We are introduced to a condition. The darkness was upon the face of the deep, which will make it an effect. Uncle Mars, would you agree?
Well, it is a state.
Yeah, a state or condition.
Whether it's an effect, we don't know, because effects normally come into being as a result of something.
Yeah, so what we are saying is, right, a condition, a state, all of them, the technical word we use is fluent, right? What the something is, but the thing is what action or event initiated that condition or state. Are you getting the picture clear? Oh, is that making sense? Cynthia, is it making sense?
Yes.
Okay. Stark, you
I don't
getting
get it? No, I didn't get it.
Oh, you didn't get it. Okay. What we are saying, back to verse 1, we said God created the earth. God created the heaven. And we made mention of the common sense law of inertia, that if something is left at a place, unless something else, an event or somebody does something to it, one would expect that thing to be there. If I put a book, my book on my desk, right, and nobody takes it, or an earthquake does not knock it down, or else, then all things being equal, my book will be there.
Yes.
That is what we call the common sense law of inertia. However, if we apply that to verse 1, then God created the heaven and the earth in a perfect state, because this is your clue. God or the text does not tell us anything about heaven, which would mean that at least heaven was still in the state God created it as in T1. Is that making sense? But here we are in T2.
Let me add the other law of the opposite of inertia. The other law of kinetics also says that a body will continue to roll or accelerate until an impressed force acts on it. For instance, if you have a tennis ball and you roll it down the street, it will continue to move straight until something stops it. That is the opposite of inertia.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, kinetics, right? Okay. Yeah, go on, Uncle Max.
I still think we are reading this wrong. You know, we are assuming that verse 1 represents T1.
Yes.
Proposing
let's for now assume that we are assigning arbitrary time.
Yeah, but suppose verse 1 is a summary statement and it represents T2 to T5. Not just
would that be a justification for it?
Say again?
Would there be a justification for that argument? Saying that the author has taken the trouble to provide more information, right?
There is justification for that statement.
Okay.
Because at the end of the chapter, God has created heaven and earth, and we have the details of heaven and earth.
Okay.
Chapter verse 1, as it were, it can be read as a statement of intent.
That is
as a summary of what has happened.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's nothing to say that there's nothing to, let me put this way, there's nothing to say otherwise, because the sequence of events that follows from verse 1 shows how the earth comes into being from the void, from being nothing, which is where you would expect to start. If it's a creation story, you start off from nothing, but that nothing is only referenced from verse 2 onwards, not in verse 1. So I don't see how you can have something that has been created in verse 1, and then suddenly in verse 2 it is disappeared into nothingness and void, and then it gets reintroduced again in verse 3, 4, 5, and 6. It doesn't make sense.
Yes, but Uncle Max, you are absolutely right. But we can only come to that conclusion at the end of the whole chapter. But for now, we are only dealing with 1 to 5, right? And so I want to restrict ourselves, because don't forget, if you just jump all the way there, you might miss some details and you might miss some sequences, right, that are as important as coming up with the big picture, right? So
I hear you, Pastor, but you see, the problem with this approach is the challenge of science today. When things get broken down into their constituent parts, and then we get surprised when we don't get the full picture, because we have not started out looking at the whole system. We try to, we assume that the system is completely made up of its constituent parts, without understanding that sometimes the sum is, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Agreed.
So it's not everything that, we can break down into, okay, let's just look at the first 5 verses and we think we can get a handle on the totality of the thing just by focusing on the first 5 verses, when the critical explanation in verse 7 and 8.
Yeah, I agree. But Uncle Mas, I'm not cutting you. We are dealing with a little bit, call it pedagogy, right? What we are trying to do is learning some advanced, call them tricks, right? Now, you remember yesterday, I made mention of default reasoning or default logic, where you jump to a conclusion because you have incomplete information, right? But that enables you to keep going until you get more data. Once more data become available, you have, in fact, you are duty bound to change your conclusion if the data so warrants. Are you getting me? So we are.
That's what we are doing here then?
Yes, actually that's because if we take it, the big picture, it might overwhelm all of us, and you see us jumping all over the place. But as we develop thought after thought after thought, each time we get to learn something new, we will learn to rework or edit our conclusion if the data would warrant it, right? So that is the goal, and that's the method I'm using for now. So I agree. I agree with you.
Let me ask you. So why is so much emphasis made on the earth and nothing about heaven? Is it
because that's where God wants you? God put you here. And that's why I have a problem with this, our focus on going to heaven. And then we leave the earth unattended. In fact, there is an old Greek joke that Pythagoras, right? He was so heavily minded looking at heavenly bodies and everything. He was walking towards a market and he wasn't paying attention because he was watching the heavens and the movement of the heavenly bodies and everything. And he fell into a well. And then he was crying for help. A little girl came and said, "Oh, Pythagoras, you are so caught up in heaven that you are useless on this earth. Stay there until you learn that earth also needs attention. Then you will come out," right? So the earth is where we are, right? The most immediate impact of the bodies that call it act on us, the most that has immediate, the one that has the most immediate impact is the earth, right? So let's take care of that. And I believe that's what God, because that's where he gave us authority, right? Because you go to 26, he gave us he said we should be the custodians of the earth. Put it in advanced language, right? We become the custodians of the earth. So that's where God wants us to function, and we'll leave it at that, right? Okay, but let's keep going. I mean, developing this very well, right? So I said verse 2, we are introduced to conditions which will be effects here, right? We are told of the earth being void, the earth being formless, but I didn't add those two, but I added darkness was upon the face of the deep. That was a state of the earth, right? But if this was true, and even if we add the other two, if they were true, right, we want to know the action or the event that produced that effect or effects. Here we are not told, right? Don't forget, I told you about a kind of argument where you are given the end result and then the effects. And you have to come up with a sequence of actions that could produce the effect. Verse 2 is the kind of argument, we call it abduction. Abduction. Here we are given effects and we are given the state, but we are not given the action. It is now up to us to find the sort of action that produced the effect, the darkness upon the face of the earth. And that's why we asked, in the description, the state of affairs in verse 2, as we find it, was it also the state of affairs in verse 1 when God created it, the head? Are you getting the picture clear? And that's where the gap theory comes in, right? The gap theory says, listen, if we look at this text carefully, something happened between verse 1 and verse 2, right? Something happened, we are not told. So that gap is the event and the time associated with that event that initiated the effects in verse 2. Amen. Hello?
Yes.
Okay. We are going on. Okay. Now, the fourth thing still on the screen, right? You see the initiate, right? Which tells you of an action or event, right? God calls into being light, right? So call into being God light, right? What will be the effect of God calling light into being?
Illumination.
Illumination, right? Illumination. But that also takes us to a very important distinction, Uncle Max. Don't forget, in what time have we allotted to the T4, right? But you realize that the earth without darkness upon the deep, that upon the face of the deep, we've given it what? T2.
Yeah.
You understand? That means we haven't accounted for T3. Right? T3 is actually God moving upon the face of the waters.
Okay.
Don't forget, we are talking about that. But the reason I haven't brought that move of God on the face of the waters is we don't have an effect of that. So we have an action without a corresponding effect. Except that you can argue that when God moved upon the face of the waters, he learned that the earth was not void because water is matter, right? But in terms of what effect, direct effect that we can point to, that the moving on the face of the waters produced, the test doesn't give us. And I decided not to come up with one out of thin air. Unless somebody...
Let's pump the brakes a little bit. You were saying that God learned that the earth wasn't void. But
Yes.
in verse 2, wasn't the same God who created the earth to be void and formless?
That's the perfect argument. That's what we are trying to understand. That's why I asked the question, when God created the earth, right? Did he create it in the state we meet the earth in verse 2? Are you not getting the picture clear? In verse 2 is different because don't forget, let's go back to the text. We said in number 2, right? If God created the earth, right? The common sense law of inertia will say the earth will be in the state God created it unless something happened. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now we have the earth with some descriptions or property descriptions that would suggest that something had happened to the earth. This was not the earth God created. So what is it? What event or what action led to the state of the earth in verse 2? Are you not getting the picture? Dr. Boyson?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting it. Yeah, I mean,
okay.
But I think it's just a matter of progression. I believe it's like, okay, somebody, who was it? Was it Henry Ford who I learned produced a car and realized that he didn't include a reverse gear or something, and later on he worked on it to produce. So it's like God started from somewhere and realized, okay, now this is where I started with. I'm going to progress, advance, and move to another stage, and that is the way I'm looking.
Yeah, that's perfect. But we still want to examine and probe that fact. Wow. Right? We want to. Are you getting me? Yeah. We want to. Can we justify that argument? Or can we find additional data to confirm or to knock down whatever our observation is?
Yeah, they did. Finally.
Is that making sense?
Yes.
Uncle Max, you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. Cynthia, what do you think?
I'm okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Okay. So let's keep moving, right?
Yeah.
So I said in the number 4, I didn't include the action or the event where God moved upon the face of the waters because I couldn't identify a corresponding effect of that action. Is that making sense? But because it happened at T4, but we have the movement, the coming into being of light happened at T4. But before T4, we only have T2, right? There has to be a T3, and I just told you that T3 is the God moving on the face of the waters. But because I couldn't find a corresponding effect, I left it out. And that will pick it up again when actually we identify the actions by themselves and the effects also by themselves. So we are in for quite a ride, right? So we agreed that when, Uncle Max, you said the effect of God calling light into being will be what?
Illumination.
Illumination. But look at what the term I used. What is it?
No darkness, illuminated earth.
Why do you think that actually is better than just illumination?
Well, you're giving the illumination a subject or a focus.
Okay. I know we would have to advance a little, go further for you to really get the picture. Now, don't forget, in verse 2 and time 2, we are told of darkness on the whole earth because it was on the face of the deep, so nothing could be seen, right? God Almighty himself, he only had to move on the surface of the water. Why did he move on the surface? Because he couldn't see anything, God himself. So,
Pastor.
Yeah.
I have another little challenge with verse 2. Because we are making an assumption here that the deep and the face of the waters, or rather the waters, were part of the earth. What if they weren't? What if they're completely separate things?
No, but if you are introduced, I mean, you are critical reading, you are introduced to the earth. Everything about verse 2 pertained to the earth, right? That's what the author.
I'm not sure, because verse 1 talks about two things: heaven and earth.
Yeah, but verse 2 talks only about earth.
No, that's an assumption. It starts off talking about earth. It says
about the earth.
Without form and void. But then it says darkness was upon the face of the deep. The deep could be something else.
No, but that would be a violation of grammatical mechanics. For you to talk about something without an antecedent.
No, Pastor, because again, if that same verse, if the waters were with the earth in verse 2, then the earth could not be void.
But that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point I'm making, and I have made all around that God is really teaching us something, right? That is actually...
This is a statement that is self-contradictory in that case.
No, it is not, because God is teaching us, right? You remember we said, when you do default reasoning when your data is incomplete. But when you get additional data, you rework your conclusion. Are you understanding? So here we come. Now God moves upon the face of the waters. He realizes that, listen, the earth contains matter. If the earth contains matter, the void goes away. So you rework your observation that the earth was void, and that was the reason I didn't include it. Are you not getting the picture? Because it was only an observation, but it was not knowledge, it was belief. It was belief, and belief is based on nothing but conjectures most times.
Yeah, but
right?
Pastor,
So
this also is a conjecture because there are alternative possibilities, alternative explanations, and we are not looking at them.
Okay.
Go
ahead and present your
argument. The assumption that the deep and the waters refers to the earth, and we are proceeding on that assumption.
Yes, the reason being, the author has mentioned the earth 2 times prior. So that gives us at least a justified assumption.
But the author has also mentioned heaven. So
no, but you realize
maybe the deep and the water associated heaven than earth. We don't know.
I agree. But you see, we have grammatical conventions and writing conventions that if you are talking about a particular thing, right, then you can keep talking about it if you have already established what we call the antecedent of that thing. And that is where we have the, what is it? You have the noun, and then you have the pronoun, right? Because you can't just use a pronoun without giving the noun, right? The noun gives you the antecedent of the pronoun. And so here we are. The author is in verse 2 talking about the earth. And again, that actually is one of the reasons the gap theory is so a controversial thing that we can't ignore. That, yeah, you've made the right call that it could be the deep could be referring to heaven. But the author in verse 2, the first 2 things, 2 observations, have to do with the earth. Why would he go and bring up something about the heaven without mentioning the antecedent heaven in verse 2? You getting me? So, yeah, you may have a perfect argument, but this is a better argument that if earth is mentioned twice, then if something is mentioned and it doesn't actually give the actual antecedent, then you'll be justified in concluding that the author is still on the antecedent, referring to the antecedent.
Even though the author is contradicting himself.
No, he is not. Yes. The author is not. Because, again, we are dealing with God giving us a model to follow, right? Don't forget, God had this book to be written not for himself, but for us. Is that making sense? God doesn't need a Bible. He is. So he had the Bible to be written for us, our benefit, not for him. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So we are learning how to train the mind, how God is training our minds by giving us a model to follow, right? That, hey, when you are confronted or you encounter a situation where you don't have all the facts and you are stuck, but you need to make progress, jump to a conclusion, but make a notation that if additional data becomes available, that conclusion will need to be reworked or edited or revised. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we are seeing. That's what we are seeing. And that is why this is important, that God could have asked for anything in time T4, right? Instead, he asked for light. And we know the properties and the benefits of light, right? And you said, when light appears, what happens to darkness?
Flies away.
Darkness goes away. And now it becomes important. If God asked for light, what would he see? He will see the deep now, because the darkness will go away. Are you not getting the picture clear? So if you look, let me take you down. If you look at actions that terminated effects in this text, you realize that terminates, God call into being God light, darkness at the state of the earth, darkness on the face of the deep is terminated. Are you getting the picture clear? Uncle Max?
Yeah, I'm listening.
But do you agree that when light came into being,
if it was
terminated
directed,
the state of affairs of darkness covering the deep, the face of the deep?
if it was directed at the deep, yes.
No, it doesn't. No, the deep
further
actually,
in the chapter, there's talk about the light illuminating different parts of creation, and there are different lights.
No, because God now creates in verse 14 down, creates objects to capture the light. So again, we would have, if we were to go do the whole chapter, we would have to actually make a distinction between the light, the sun and the moon that God created, and the light that he called forth in verse 2. Oh, is it verse 3? Right? These are the very interesting things in the Bible that we have to understand.
Unless we assume that in verse 3, he calls forth the principle of light without necessarily allocating it here or there. And then further down the chapter, he explains where the light should go. So he talks about the lights in the heavens.
That is true. Again, Uncle Max, we are going step by step. Don't for pedagogy, right? If we keep moving far away, we might end up confusing ourselves the more, right? But you have a point. You have an absolute perfect point, right? But at this point, since we are dealing with only verse 1 and verse 5, we want to use that to train ourselves to acquire certain skills, right? One of them, doing default reasoning when data is insufficient or incomplete. Then when data becomes available, right, more data becomes available, you rework or you revise your conclusion. It's a skill we are learning and doing that gradually.
Pastor, at times too, you see that the sun doesn't come up, but still the world is not dark. You have some light you can see. You don't see the sun.
It's an amazing thing.
Yes, the sun doesn't come. So it's not only the sun that gives light. God's light too is there without the sun, without the moon.
It's in fact, if you read the Genesis account, at least the first 2 chapters, right? One, you realize a lot of God will say something and then actually concretize it in the form of either making, forming, or creating an object to represent it. Right? So these are running themes in the text, right? But here again, we are trying to make sense of this text one step at a time, building our skills at a time, right? As we go on. But Uncle Mas, you are perfectly right, spot on. Okay. Now, okay, so let's go back to, I said, why is it that, Uncle Mas, you no darkness illuminated earth, right? And let's answer that question. Why? Why it's important to put it this way. If we assume, now I will adopt your language, if we assume, right, that in verse 2, when the darkness covered the face of the deep, it had to do with the whole earth. And he said it covers the face, right? So there was a surface of the earth and there was depth, but that depth was hidden. Why? Because there was darkness at the surface. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Mas, you agree?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Okay, so if there was darkness on the face of the deep at one time, the whole earth was dark. Now God speaks light into being. And we know that when light appears, darkness disappears, right?
Yeah.
So when God speaks light into being, we don't know how long it lasted, but the whole earth was illuminated and there was no darkness anywhere. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah.
Yeah, Uncle Mas, you agree?
Yes.
Well, I was it's a bit of a stretch of an assumption, but
okay.
Maybe.
I mean, again, the argument is if darkness covered the face of the deep, the earth, so you couldn't see anything, and God speaks light into being, and we know that with the appearance of light, there is the disappearance of darkness. True? So the whole earth at that point was lit, was illuminated, and there was no darkness anywhere. Fair assumption, right? So we move from 100% darkness to 100% light at all times.
You know, Pastor, someone wrote a series of books, very, very deep, profound books on genetics and character and values and so on. It was called The Wars of Light and Shadow. Light and shadow. And it is a property of light that it gets interrupted by objects, which then leave behind them a shadow. And the thing about the earth and the shape as we know it today is that you may illuminate one side of it, but the other side remains in shadow, which is explained further down this particular chapter. So what I'm not sure or clear is why we need to make the assumption that the whole earth
because
at the same time.
No, because you are dealing with God who encounters a situation concerning the whole earth, darkness. And he speaks light into being without qualification as to where the light shines. So we would assume.
Or indeed doesn't. Maybe the light doesn't shine at all until he divides it into day and night.
But the Bible says, and there was light. So we can't actually assume beyond the fact that the Bible says it was light.
Yeah, Pastor, again, though, if you're going to be strictly accurate, we can have light without having illumination.
We are using those two words interchangeably, right? Illumination actually comprises darkness and light. Both constitute illumination. The low end of it is darkness. The high end of it is light, but it's still illumination, right? But what we are dealing with here is, let's say, the high illumination, where objects emit a certain amount of heat and therefore they become visible, right? That is the light we are talking about. So we are saying that at a certain point in verse 2, time T2, the whole earth was not visible because darkness held sway. Then, in time T4, God speaks light into being. And we know that when light appears, darkness disappears. And there is no qualification with that statement as to which part of the earth received that illumination and which part didn't. So we would assume that every bit of the earth where darkness held sway, light took over and darkness left the scene. Is that a fair assumption? Dr. Boise, is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I could go with that.
Okay. Cynthia, fair assumption?
Yes, I agree.
Charles, fair assumption? Auntie Ruby?
Yes, I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
Okay. We can continue. We can continue. Okay.
Yeah.
So, now, the no darkness illuminated earth, that's where it came from, that in time T4, right, the whole earth had light. So darkness was nowhere to be found until God did something, right? In time T5, God divided the light from the darkness. Oh, that also actually brings out an action, because it means that in time T2, when darkness covered the face of the deep, it also contained light, which is to say, at time T2, darkness and light were fused together. Is that a good argument? You see, again, we are taking the trouble to tease out all these things. That is what will make us more diligent than our peers, and we may be able to achieve more, therefore. Are you getting me? Because if we just gloss over this, a lot of data will not be touched.
Yeah.
Right? So here we come. In time T5, God makes light distinct from darkness. At this point, therefore, you have time divided for within call it, if it was a 24-hour period, you have part of the 24-hour period where light would hold sway, and 12 hours of that 24-hour period, darkness would hold sway. Are you getting me? Which again is almost like a fusion of verse 2 and verse 3. So now I call it alternating day and night. That was T5. Is that making sense? Because in time T2, it was all darkness, nothing else. In time T4, right, it was all light, no darkness. In time T5, we have darkness, and then we have light, followed by darkness, and then light, darkness, light. And then God, therefore, now was able or not able, decides to give timing elements or this thing, calling it the evening and the morning constituting the first day, right? So again, the next week we'll look at the different aspects of time, right, that we can identify in this test. Though for here now, we are given just integer numbers to the time T1, T2, T3, right? We know that T2 happened after T1 and T1 happened before T2, right? T2 happened before T3, T3 happened before T4, T4 happened before T5, so forth and so on, right? But we are getting to now understand that when we take a text, let's say even a storybook, right? We want to identify, it isn't everything that is an action. We want to see what did a particular character do. And when that character did that thing, what did it lead to, right? Down the line, we will realize also that certain actions actually initiate other actions, not just effects. Or certain effects are also actions in themselves. We'll get to whether we find them in this test is another interesting thing, right? But is that making sense, the way we've gone about it, that these are little things in the text that we really need to look at in order to really do justice to the text? Do we agree?
Yes.
Everybody, please. Yeah, Uncle Mas, go ahead.
I think you may need to revisit your point 4.
Okay.
The description of no darkness illuminated. Yes.
Okay.
Give the light of point 5, where the light is separated from the darkness, and we use the word fused. The darkness was fused with the light. Then it calls into question whether in T4, whether the darkness or the light dominated.
Yeah, T4, the light
dominated. If the two were fused, then we can't say no darkness. The darkness was there. So
I get what I get. I think. Thank you. Just that, as I was thinking, it's like, wow, heavy language. That's all I can say. Because, because look at it carefully. If we go back to the text, God just said, "Let there be light," right? And the word light, let, means permit, right? So God was speaking to something. God spoke to darkness, right? And so these are, again, I could be wrong, but I thought about it and said, you know something, these are arguments for another time, but we need to progress, right? So I agree. In fact, Genesis 1:2, light was already present. However, it was fused with darkness, and darkness actually was the dominant of the two, the more dominant of the two, right? And so in time T4, light became the more dominant, right? Very interesting. But as I said, the word illumination actually contains both darkness and light, because darkness is still an aspect of illumination. True? Is that true?
Yeah,
Yes.
how can darkness be an
Yeah. The
how
word
can
illumination,
That's why he separated them.
yeah, the word illumination simply implies, right? In fact, if you read Genesis 8:20-22, God said, as long as the earth remains, right, day and night shall not cease, right? Day and night shall not cease. And meanwhile, we know in Genesis 1, verse 5, is it 4 or 5? God called the day, called light day, right? And he called darkness night. So we know back there, God was still talking about illumination in Genesis chapter 8, right? The two aspects of illumination, darkness, which is the low end of light where objects are not emitting enough heat for them to become visible. And then the high end, which we call light, right, where objects are emitting enough heat to make them visible.
Pastor, scientifically speaking, that actually isn't correct,
Okay. No, I'm not a scientist, so.
What you're talking about is radiance. Radiance.
Okay.
So there's an internal light that we are capable of producing. Okay. And we become radiant when we produce that internal light. Okay. But illumination is to do with light falling on us, on an object, and being reflected off that object.
Okay.
So you illuminate something by shining a light onto it. And then we see the object from the light that is reflected off the object. That's illumination. The other bit is radiance.
Okay.
Or radiation, if you like.
Okay. I agree. Yeah. I agree. You're absolutely right. Of course, you are the scientist, so I would defer to your judgment on that. Okay, so point 6, right? Okay, point 5, we said now we have alternating day and night, right? We have alternating light will be dominant part of the day and darkness will be dominant part of the day, right? Now, that phenomenon is different from where darkness holds sway completely and the situation where light holds sway completely, right? So it's like we are back to verse 2 when darkness and light may have been actually fused together, right? But this time, God captures both and then makes them dominant at any particular time in a, let's say, a measured time period, whether 24 hours, 1 year, whatever it is, right? But that is what we are trying to understand, and we realize that these are things that if we are able to capture them, will help us to really understand the text very well, right? And then I think this is a good place. We've gone past. So we'll stop at, or let me finish verse 7, number 7. No, verse 6 is when God names called light day, called night, this into permanent identity, right? These objects were given their permanent identity, right? So that's about it, 6 and 7, right? He called light day, he called darkness
night.
So this is yeah. So we have the the two aspects of illumination getting their permanent identity, unless something else happens to change it. For now, that's what we have from the moment God called part of the day a night and part of the day, right? That's what we have, right? Next week, we'll actually take the time to look at the time elements involved. Okay, now, I mean, we talked about this, the actions that terminated effects, right? We looked at just the last one. We didn't look at this, but we'll look at them. And then we'll actually look at each of the actions critically. And what do we get, the same as the effects, when we treat them individually, right? What we get out of it. So we'll end here. God bless you. I think if anybody you are led, you can say the final prayer for us. Else, Uncle Max, you will have the honor since you've been away for the last 11 years.
Is anybody else led?
I think you are led. You are led. So please.
Shall we?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you are.
Cynthia wanted to say something.
No, please.